POV Cyrillic letter 456, DOML Ya Gemini, the sewage system collapsed at the most critical operational moment. While F-35 stealth fighters were being catapulted from the flight deck for high-stakes missions in the Middle East, the latrines below deck overflowed. Over 4,500 sailors suddenly found themselves hostages to a cascading plumbing failure inside a $13 billion warship. How long can an aircraft carrier sustain combat operations with a malfunctioning sanitation network? What is the exact mechanical protocol when the plumbing of a floating city critically fails? And will this internal crisis dictate the course of United States military operations? We are going to examine the systemic failure aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. During its extended 2025 and 2026 deployment, which stretched from operational zones near Venezuela to the hostile waters of the Middle East, the CVN-78 experienced a daily, relentless breakdown of its waste management systems. We will break down the engineering of the vacuum collection, holding, and transfer network to understand why it was installed and why it is failing. We will analyze the physical toll on the hull technicians working 19-hour repair shifts, the financial burden of $400,000 acid flushes, and the severe physiological impact on a crew forced to wait up to 45 minutes simply to use a restroom. This is the logistical reality of the Navy's most advanced supercarrier. To understand why the plumbing on the USS Gerald R. Ford is failing, you must examine the ship's initial blueprints. The Ford-class carrier was designed to be a definitive technological leap over the legacy Nimitz-class ships. The architects prioritized weight reduction, space efficiency, and power generation. Every internal system was scrutinized to see where bulk could be eliminated to make room for new technologies like electromagnetic aircraft launch systems and dual-band radar. Traditional aircraft carriers utilize gravity-fed plumbing networks, known as CHT systems, collection, holding, and transfer. Gravity systems require massive amounts of flush water and large-diameter piping angled downward to move waste into centralized holding tanks. These pipes take up significant internal volume and add tremendous physical weight to the ship. To solve this, naval engineers equipped the Gerald R. Ford with a VCHT system, vacuum collection, holding, and transfer. This technology operates on the exact same principles as the lavatories on a commercial airliner. When a user presses the flush mechanism, a valve opens, and the severe pressure differential between the ambient cabin air and the pressurized holding tank creates a violent suction. The waste is instantly pulled out of the stainless steel bowl at high velocity. From an engineering standpoint, VCHT is highly efficient. It requires only a fraction of a gallon of water per flush, drastically reducing the demand on the ship's desalination evaporators. Because the system relies on vacuum suction rather than gravity, waste can be pulled horizontally or even upward. This allowed the shipbuilders to use significantly narrower pipes and route the plumbing through tight, previously unusable spaces within the hull. The system functions flawlessly on a commercial aircraft. However, a Boeing 777 carries 300 passengers for a maximum of 16 hours. The USS Gerald R. Ford carries over 4,500 sailors who live, work, and process food on board 24 hours a day for 9 consecutive months. Scaling commercial vacuum technology up to the size of a floating, heavily industrialized city resulted in a catastrophic miscalculation in fluid dynamics. The failure of the Ford sanitation system is driven by a combination of basic chemistry and human behavior in a high-stress environment. The primary technical failure stems from the diameter of the piping. Because the designers relied on high-velocity vacuum pressure, the pipes are narrow. When urine passes through a low-water vacuum system, a specific chemical reaction occurs. Uric acid precipitates out of the fluid and crystallizes, forming a hard, calcified scale on the interior walls of the pipes. In a traditional gravity-fed system, the sheer volume of water from each flush acts as a diluting agent, washing this scale down into the tanks. In the Ford's low-water environment, the calcium concrete builds up rapidly. Month by month, millimeter by millimeter, the interior diameter of the plumbing shrinks. As the pipes calcify, the vacuum pressure drops because the system has to work harder to pull air and mass through a restricted opening. The second variable is the crew. A population of 4,500 people generates an immense amount of physical debris. In the fast-paced, exhausting environment of a deployed aircraft carrier, foreign objects inevitably enter the plumbing network. The sailors drop rags, small pocket tools slip from coveralls, items of clothing and prohibited sanitary products are flushed. In a wide-diameter gravity pipe, a small rag might eventually wash through to the main holding tank without incident. In the severely calcified, narrow pipes of the Ford's VCHT network, a single rag acts as a permanent seal. It travels through the pipe until it hits a bottleneck created by the calcium buildup. The vacuum pressure slams the object tightly into the gap, and the pipe seals completely shut. When a blockage occurs, the architectural design of the VCHT system maximizes the damage. The network is divided into operational zones. Multiple toilets, sometimes dozens across an entire berthing block, are connected to a single localized vacuum manifold controlled by a series of pressure valves. If one pipe in that sector clogs or if a single vacuum boundary valve fails to seat properly, the entire zone instantly loses suction. This means that a single flushed item on the second deck can immediately disable 50 toilets across multiple compartments. The failure is not isolated, it is systemic and cascading. The fundamental flaws of the VCHT system were severely tested during the Gerald R. Ford's 2025 to 2026 extended deployment. The operational tempo for this mission was exceptionally high. The strike group was tasked with projecting power across multiple theaters, conducting operations off the coast of Venezuela before being redirected to the Middle East to manage escalating regional conflicts. The crew was operating at maximum capacity. The flight operations ran around the clock. Mechanics, radar operators, and aviation bosun's mates were working 12 to 16-hour shifts. According to internal Navy maintenance logs and reports reviewed by civilian media and government oversight committees, the plumbing system collapsed under the strain of the deployment. The VCHT network was failing daily. The data reveals the staggering scale of the crisis. During one specific 4-day window, maintenance crews recorded 205 separate plumbing failures. There are approximately 650 toilets installed on the CVN-78. When multiple vacuum zones fail simultaneously, a massive percentage of those toilets go offline. The logistical impact on the crew's daily routine is severe. A sailor waking up at 04:00 hours to prepare for a flight deck shift operates on a strict timeline. They have a narrow window to shower, shave, use the restroom, and eat before reporting to their station. During this deployment, sailors routinely walked into their designated berthing bathrooms to find the stalls secured with red tape and a notification that the vacuum boundary had failed. This forces the sailor to navigate the labyrinth of the ship, climbing up and down vertical ladder wells across multiple decks, actively searching for a functioning bathroom. Because several zones are down simultaneously, the few operational toilets become critical choke points. Dozens of sailors converge on the same functioning bathroom, creating massive queues. Wait times to use a toilet routinely reached 45 minutes. The physiological consequences of this logistical failure directly affect the crew's operational efficiency. A radar operator in the Combat Direction Center tracking incoming aerial threats, or a nuclear machinist mate monitoring the reactor core, cannot abandon their post to stand in a line for an hour. Personnel were forced to hold their bodily functions to the point of severe physical discomfort and pain, directly distracting them from highly sensitive, mission-critical tasks. When access to basic sanitation is systematically denied, the internal environment of the ship degrades rapidly. Faced with extreme wait times and biological necessity, desperate personnel resort to unauthorized makeshift solutions. Industrial drains and buckets become alternative latrines. The odor of raw sewage permeates the passageways. The meticulously maintained interior of the ship transforms into a hazardous biological environment. Morale on a warship relies heavily on a predictable routine and basic living standards. The crew is trained to endure sleep deprivation, poor food quality, and the stress of combat operations. However, chronic unsanitary conditions and the daily struggle to perform basic bodily functions breed deep internal frustration. Conflicts between sailors standing in endless lines became a routine occurrence. Sleep deprivation worsened as personnel were forced to wake up an hour earlier than necessary simply to secure a place in the bathroom queue before their shift commenced. While the general crew navigates the queues, the burden of maintaining the collapsing system falls entirely on a specific division of sailors, the hull technicians. The HTs are the welders, pipefitters, and plumbers of the Navy. On the Gerald R. Ford, they serve as the frontline defense against the ship's own architectural flaws. When a VCHT zone fails, the HT division is mobilized to locate and extract the blockage. Tracing a vacuum leak or a physical clog through miles of narrow, interconnected piping is a highly complex mechanical task. Because the system operates under severe pressure differentials, opening a pipe to clear a blockage is inherently hazardous. If the vacuum pressure is not properly isolated beforehand, or if a corroded valve gives way during the maintenance procedure, the pipe will violently decompress. This results in a catastrophic release known internally as blowing inboard. The pipe bursts open, and highly pressurized raw sewage, chemical scale, and toxic hydrogen sulfide gas explode into the compartment. The hull technicians are completely covered in biological waste. During the peak of the plumbing crisis, the volume of failures was so massive that the hull technicians operated in a perpetual state of emergency triage. The ship's engineering command placed the HT division on extreme rotational shifts. Men and women were required to work up to 19 hours a day. They would sleep for a maximum of 4 hours before being woken up to wade back into the raw sewage. They operate in heavy rubber protective suits, face shields, and respirators in the sweltering heat of the ship's mechanical spaces. They utilize mechanical snakes, chemical solvents, and sheer physical force to break apart the calcified concrete and extract the physical debris choking the network. Their labor is a continuous losing battle. The hull technicians are treating a symptom, not the underlying engineering disease. Regardless of how efficiently they clear a clog, the narrow diameter of the pipes and the physics of the vacuum system guarantee that another zone will fail just hours later. The senior leadership of the United States Navy is fully aware of the architectural flaw within the Ford class. However, retrofitting the entire plumbing network of a commissioned, active-duty nuclear aircraft carrier is practically impossible. It would require stripping the vessel down to its structural bulkheads, cutting through decks to remove miles of narrow VCHT piping, and replacing it with wide-diameter gravity tubes. The financial cost and the years required in drydock would cripple the operational availability of the fleet. Consequently, the Navy relies on aggressive chemical maintenance to keep the existing system functional. To dissolve the massive accumulation of uric acid and calcium scale inside the pipes, the Navy conducts specialized shipwide chemical flushes. They introduce highly concentrated industrial-grade acid into the VCHT network. The acid violently reacts with the calcium deposits, effectively burning the scale off the interior walls and theoretically restoring the original diameter of the pipes. This process is logistically complex, highly toxic, and exceptionally expensive. According to reports compiled by the Government Accountability Office, a single comprehensive acid flush of the CVN-78 sanitation system costs the military approximately $400,000. $400,000 per flush, specifically allocated to unclog the pipes. Furthermore, this chemical treatment is a temporary measure. The calcium scaling process begins again the exact moment the acid is purged from the system. Since the ship entered active service, and accelerating dramatically over recent deployments, the Gerald R. Ford has required external civilian contractors to board the vessel in port dozens of times to execute these chemical resets. During the extended Middle East deployment, the ship's crew had to execute localized acid treatments themselves while underway, consuming massive stores of hazardous materials just to keep a minimum viable percentage of the toilets functioning. There is a profound disconnect between the grim reality on the lower decks and the official public posture of the naval chain of command. Official statements from Navy leadership maintain that the USS Gerald R. Ford is executing its deployments flawlessly. When questioned by defense reporters and congressional oversight committees regarding the reports of daily sewage overflows, 45-minute lines, and exhausted maintenance crews, the response is heavily curated. Naval spokespersons acknowledge the plumbing issues as ongoing maintenance challenges, but definitively state that these problems do not degrade the combat readiness of the vessel or hinder its ability to execute its mission. From a strictly mechanical and tactical metric, the Navy's statement is technically accurate. The A-1B nuclear reactors continue to provide maximum power. The dual-band radar tracks incoming ballistic and aerial threats. The electromagnetic catapults successfully launch fully loaded strike fighters into the combat theater. The weapons systems operate as designed. However, this bureaucratic definition of combat readiness completely ignores the human personnel required to operate the machinery. A stealth fighter cannot execute a strike package autonomously. It requires the aviation mechanic who torques the bolts, the ordnance handler who programs the munitions, and the air traffic controller who clears the flight deck. When those exact personnel are severely sleep-deprived because they spent an hour waiting to use a toilet, when they are carrying the psychological fatigue of living in a zone that smells of raw waste, when the hull technicians are physically collapsing from 19-hour shifts, the overall operational effectiveness of the crew degrades. Fatigue directly causes critical errors. On an aircraft carrier, a critical error does not mean a missed deadline. A critical error results in a jet crashing into the deck. It results in a fire in the engineering spaces. It results in casualties. The plumbing crisis on the CVN-78 serves as a stark case study in the limits of technological optimization. The engineers who designed the Ford class focused relentlessly